So let's talk about one of the most controversial mechanics in Star Wars CCG history, pod racing. It's very timely right now because there is the Decipher Cards Only event going on GEMP right now for a couple more weeks. And Decipher Cards Only just means it's all the cards that Decipher printed from 1995 to 2001 before they lost the license with Lucasfilm. So it's the cards from like prior to the formation of the Players Committee and prior to the creation of the virtual cards. So this event is pretty fun. I love playing this format. I think there could be a couple things done that would really open the format up and honestly, probably make it like a perfect format, which is, one of the best ways would be just to include the virtual shields. There was some shields that were created by the Players Committee shortly after the formation of the Players Committee that would really even out the power level of some of the decks. But again, since that was after the Decipher Cards era, those shields are not in this. Are not eligible to be played in this tournament. So you had to kind of deal with some of the old shields that weren't as good against some of the powerful decks. So what are those powerful decks? Well, I'd say that the top deck for light side has been the lightsaber combat deck with the Will Handle This objective. I have made a video about that objective in the past, not too long ago, if you want to look for that. I play lightsaber combat for my light side deck, and I did pretty well with it. I went 4-2. I was so close to being 5-1. I played against two-time world champion Johnny Chu in one of my rounds, and one of the last rounds that I played. I had him on the ropes, and then he just straight out played me at the end, and he ended up getting the win. But yeah, that's one that I wish I had back. Of course, that's one that I'll probably never forget. But anyway, I ended up going 8-4 overall in the event for my 12 matches, which is, I don't know, I would have loved to have done better, of course, but I don't know, it was my first event on GEMP ever, so there's that. Let's see, there's 3 people right now that are 11-1. So, and this is a tournament that cuts the top 4, so it looks like you're probably gonna have to be 11-1 or better. There may be one 10-2 that ends up getting to the top 4, but anyway, a couple more weeks for people to get their games in. So I thought I'd just make this a quick video to kind of try and help people a little bit on this pod racing, because lightsaber, what really makes the lightsaber, there's a couple things that make lightsaber combat kind of overpowered, but one of the things that really helps is pod racing. And I've watched a lot of people play against lightsaber combat, and you can just tell that they just didn't really know what to do about pod racing. And hopefully this helps if anybody's got some matches left to play. So anyway, you're starting off with pod racing. You got to start off with this, the starting interrupt for pod racing. And I don't actually own a physical copy of the card, it turns out, so I printed one off. Anyway, you deploy starting effect or starting interrupt. You deploy the pod race arena with a pod racer. Opponent may also deploy a pod racer there. You deploy a Bounty pod race, and then any effect it deploys for free. So here's the pod racing arena. It really doesn't do much as long as the pod race is going on. It, like I said, really doesn't do much. It doesn't count as a battleground. After the pod racing is done, then it does count as a battleground, and it's really just a regular site with one light side force icon, one dark side force icon, and then the pod racers. There are 2 definite pod racers that that are the best. The other ones are really just filling up space, I would say. So, and the light side, Anakin's pod racer is the best pod racer. It is definitely better. Sebulba's pod racer is the best dark side pod racer, but this Anakin's pod racer is definitely better. A main reason is it lets you draw 2 race destiny instead of 1. And then during draw phase, if opponent has a higher race total, you can draw 3 destiny and then choose 2. So it gets really ridiculous. And then it also lets you take a card called I Did It into your hand from the reserve deck. And we'll talk about that here in a sec. So a dark side pod racer is Sebulba's pod racer. Adds 3 to each. So you normally just draw 1 race destiny each turn. If you don't have Anakin's pod racer, you're just drawing 1 destiny each turn. So with the Sebulba's pod racer, the advantage it gives you is it adds 3 to each of your race destinies. And then if you and your opponent have your same race total, you may use two force, and then opponent draws no destiny for the remainder of turn. So what you do if you're the dark side is first turn when you're both tied at 0, you use that 2 force so that they don't draw race destiny that for turn right away. So that gives you a little bit of a head start. But that's also why Anakin's Podracer being so ridiculous. So you do that, of course, to try and get a little bit of a head start. But then you're letting your opponent draw 3 race destiny and choosing 2, probably until the rest of the race or until you get behind, and then you're going to lose anyway. And then, so Bounty Podrace, this is the other card that the starting interrupt lets you go get, and it really just this really just facilitates the pod race. To pull it on the arena once per turn, you may initiate either player may initiate a pod race. The pod race drawing happens during your opponent's control phase. Yeah, it just kind of spells out things. So the winner of a pod race is a player with a race total greater than 24 and greater than the opponent's highest race total. And then the winner retrieves 6 force and loser loses 6 force. And then all the race destiny cards go in their owner's use piles, and all the pod racers are lost. So there you go. Winner retrieves 6 force and loser loses 6 force. May not seem huge, but trust me, it is a big deal, especially during a close game. It is definitely the difference maker. So one thing, if you notice there, even the reason that pod racing is so good in lightsaber combat is lightsaber combat plays a lot of high destiny cards. So so for example, I played when I was practicing. I practiced probably like 30 to 40 games, and I lost in pod racing once. And my opponent did have Sebulba's Pod Racer out, which is okay. So important to know, if you're playing a dark side, I would say that you should have Sebulba's Pod Racer in your deck, even if you are not planning on playing pod racing, because if your light side opponent, if they start with pod racing, you can go get a pod racer out of your deck also. So that's the reason to have Sebulba's Pod Racer in your deck. So at least then you have a chance at pod racing, because if you don't have Sebulba's Pod Racer in your deck, you have no chance of winning the pod race. And that's kind of one of the reasons why this is such a. It's really one of the reasons why this is such a. As a mechanic, it's so controversial, because there really was no skill involved with pod racing. It happens so early in the game. Even if you're somebody who's good at stacking destinies and tracking your destinies, it's happening so early in the game. It's probably only going to last the first 3 or 4 turns. It happens so early that you just don't even have a chance of stacking destinies. So it's completely luck, and that's really why it's so controversial. So there's a lot of Star Wars players that luck is a small factor in Star Wars, of course, but there are people who would say that one of the things about Star Wars CCG is the best player is usually going to win, because it's a very skill based game, not so much on luck of the draw, although it is still a factor. Okay, so we got this card, this I Did It card. So this is also a reason why light side pod racing is so much better than dark side pod racing, and why people are going to play with lightsaber combat. So I Did It card that you can go get right away at the beginning of the game. You have this card. You get this card like first turn in your hand from the deck, and then you just hang on to it until you win pod racing. And then it does 2 things. One, this I Did It card will also let you retrieve another 4 force. So again, if you're light side, you win pod racing, you can retrieve 10 force total after using this card. And then the other thing that it does is, at the end of opponent's turn, opponent must lose 2 force or place their force pile into their used pile. So it doesn't let your opponent sandbag any force. It doesn't let them keep any force, for things like Imperial barriers, or you play draw their fire, for example, which if during combat your opponent has to use a force before they can play an interrupt, you don't have any force, you can't. Then if draw their fires out and your opponent doesn't have any force, they can't play any interrupts during combat. So They're not going to be able to do anything tricky during combat. So this is a pretty powerful card too. And again, this is only on the light side version of Podracing, so gives a big advantage to the light side. So how do you combat some of this stuff? There's not a lot of ways. So there is a defensive shield for Podracing, and here it is. So you're gonna want to, you want to have this in you want to use it. If it looks like you're gonna lose the Podracing, you can just pull it out. As long as you have it in your stack of 10 defensive shields that you can use with the starting effect. So anyway, you want to put the defensive shield in here for in your deck for Podracing, and unless opponent occupies 3 battlegrounds, I did it as suspended, so that helps a lot. It's hard for lightsaber combat to occupy more than 2 battlegrounds. There's the 2 Naboo sites, the 2 interior Naboo sites that lightsaber combat plays, and they don't really play other battlegrounds than that. So, like I said, it can be very tricky for lightsaber combat to control or occupy more than 2 battlegrounds, so that's helpful. The other thing that it does is if Sebulba's Podrace are on table, your force loss from Boonty Podrace is reduced by X, where X equals number of battlegrounds you occupy. So if you occupy 3 battlegrounds, you only lose 3 force from losing the Podrace, which is also helpful. And then, of course, we've got the Secret Plan shield, and that's the one where you put it down and your opponent is about to retrieve X-Force. They must first use X-Force if that retrieval is canceled. So you want to get those 2 shield. Well, Secret Plans is also an effect. You may have it as an effect in play already, but if you don't play Secret Plans as an effect, you definitely want to put this shield into your shield group and play that out to help with the Podracing. So yeah, I hope that helps. If you got some matches left to play in the Decipher Cards Only tournament, hopefully this helps a little bit. But yeah, if you're playing Dark Side, get that Sebulba's Podracer in your deck. Make sure you got these shields in your deck, and hopefully it'll help you. Otherwise, lightsaber combat really strong for light side. So get some practice in. Maybe watch my video about a little bit if you're not familiar with it. And yeah, good luck in the tournament, and may the Force be with you.